Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so excited today to be talking to some of the team behind HBO Max's Our Flag Means Death. We are joined by actor Rhys Darby, who plays the lead role of Stede Bonnet, as well as creator, showrunner, and executive producer David Jenkins and executive producer Garrett Basch. And David and Garrett, I wanted to start by asking a little bit about the development process for this show and really finding the voice of what you wanted this series to be, because it obviously has that great element of creating an ecosystem that's very much the idea of a workplace comedy in a very absurd setting. And so you take these characters, you build this ecosystem, and then you get to kind of play around with that foundation by what happens when they happen upon land and they're interacting with other characters. What are the frictions and tensions that come with that? What happens when we introduce other characters and what are the reactions going to be? And so I was interested in kind of like how you saw the voice of the show coming together with creating that foundation to then be able to really play with it in different ways, episode by episode.
It's just workplace is great. I mean, work once you have, if you're at work, you know, you're not there by choice necessarily. You didn't get to pick the people you're with. So those automatically become family stories. And then they become family stories where you can transgress in other ways because you're not really related. So to find those things and then put it in the pirate genre and then kind of do Crazy Boss mixed with Walter White because he's having a midlife crisis and he's decided to do a true crime thing. I mean, it's a wonderful stew to get to cook. Is that right? I don't know. I started when I bailed.
You cook stew.
It's a wonderful stew to cook. Yeah.
Was that a lot of what appealed to you in terms of developing the show as well, Garrett?
Well, I would say in terms of voice and foundation, David is all voice and probably all foundation. And he was pretty far along by the time I came in. He had scripts. He knew exactly what the show was. And I was just there to help make sure it happened in a way that served him and served the story. And yeah, I feel just lucky to be involved.
Well, Garrett was also, he's being very modest. But Garrett, like, it was really, you know, we prepped the show and Taika was shooting Thor. And so I'm prepping it for a director that, you know, I'm making all the choices for him. And, you know, it's like I like to make big choices anyway and specific choices. But having Garrett as a resource, because he's worked with Taika so many times now, was invaluable. And then Garrett had the great sense to bring in Rob Vincent. And we actually got Rob Vincent, who's Taika's production designer. And so having the two of them as a resource while prepping it was insanely helpful.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I've never heard that before. It feels good.
Man, I love you.
Workplace comedy.
We've never met. I don't know this guy. Derek? I don't know.
Garrett, yeah.
He's got cool hair. Derek, your hair is fire. Wow.
Rhys, I feel like you had to strike a really delicate balance with this character because you're playing a character who leaves behind his entire family in the middle of this midlife crisis and sets off to do something ostensibly fairly absurd, but he's so committed to it. And, you know, I feel like you do that and you achieve that balance where the audience still is rooting for him and wants to come along for the ride and is really engaged, you know, because you're always playing to the emotional factors and motivations for him in terms of what it is that he wants as a character. And so I was just interested in how you really struck that balance in finding those emotional motivations so that the audience could really connect to your character very early on, even when the idea on paper isn't maybe something that they would get on board with otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. On paper, it's a no-go. But that just goes to show what can happen when you get off the paper, because if you've got the right person, you know, the essence of that person, their spirit will turn you. And I think that's why Stede got away with what he did and why I tried to portray that character. And that is that he was a dreamer and felt like he wasn't in the position he was supposed to be in life. He only lived once. And he read a lot and dreamt a lot and was wealthy enough to change his position. And yeah, he sort of, you know, went about it a ridiculous way. he should have at least, went through a proper divorce or told his wife what he was up to. But life is short, and even shorter back in those days. And so he's like, no, I'm out. And look, he probably had intentions of coming back. And but the thing is, he wanted to prove to himself that he could be something else in the world. And he took his garments with him, and and his library that he built onto the ship. And then he just took a massive risk to make this adventure work. And the only reason that the crew went with him to a point, or even on day one, was that he's a nice guy, and he's not a bad person. He just has no idea what he's really doing.
I mean, we don't really know what he was really like, though, so he could have actually been a dick.
No, David, come on.
I mean, the Stede Bonnet, your Stede Bonnet, is very lovable, and I would follow your Stede Bonnet into hell. But
But here's the thing: why he's not, because no one is the gentleman pirate. You don't get that word gentleman if you're a dick, especially back then. These days, it's muddied a bit, but to be a gentleman back in the day means that you're a nice person.
Yeah,
that would be my argument.
You're a very good lawyer for him.
I've got to be.
I love it. I'm gonna hire you for some legal trouble. Later today.
And David, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the language of the show when you were writing the scripts, because there's certain delicious moments where you really allow yourself to kind of lean into slightly more classical language for the sake of humor or what it tells us about a character. There's moments where Stede's kind of showing off a little bit, and then obviously there's very modern vocabulary and vernacular throughout it as well. And so, how did you think about the language that you wanted for these characters throughout the show, and what you wanted that to say about them?
I don't know. That's a great question. While I was writing it just kind of intuitively, some characters would speak like Buttons speaks kind of ye oldie. Mm-hmm. And, I just didn't want to write all of that for everybody, because it's hard to write in dialect and actually have it make sense and have it be good. I do a thing where I kind of perform the part while I'm writing it, and I say the script a lot. I talk a lot to myself when I write.
I've got to see these tapes.
He'd be on set sometimes with his laptop, and he'd just start laughing hysterically and doing voices, and everyone thought this like in the first week, and it created this error mystery.
It was intentional. It was intentional, Garrett. Fell into my trap. I see, little fly. But yeah, I think like also with this show, it's fun to break stuff, and it's fun to modernize it, because you get to talk about things that I guess are modern things, and then you get to stuff it into this world, and you can let it be new. No one wants to hear Elizabethan prose.
And talking a little bit more about Stede, Rhys, I think what's really fascinating to watch as well is having this man who is kind of in this central place where he's trying to reach a certain point in his life. He's got certain ideas of who he wants to be. And then there's the past version that he's trying to leave behind. And he's living in this very uncomfortable dichotomy within the middle of that. And how you kind of really enjoyed kind of finding a lot of the kind of emotional turmoil within him as a character, but also kind of gradually allowing him to inch a little bit closer to where he hopes to attain to be, but never actually fully realizing that.
Yeah, I think he can't escape his past, and none of us can. And you try to, by creating a new future that's going to be your new life. And up until he meets Blackbeard, that just doesn't happen. But when he meets Blackbeard, all of a sudden there's a bridge to a new life, and he feels more comfortable. He feels like he's got a friend here that he can get close to, and that hasn't happened to him before in the past, from what yet that we know. We may make that later, but at this point, he's just like a very lonely guy who really just has his fancy clothing and his way of doing things. And I think I could feel that on day one, just with the crew, of just like he's not so much commanding these people. He's kind of like going, "Please play with me." I've got these ideas, and he just wants friends, and they're like, no, you're the wrong class. You shouldn't be here. We don't like you. Although we're starting to like you because you're reading us kids' stories at night and you're paying us a wage. So they're torn. And I love that he's doing the impossible. Imagine going onto a ship in those days, being that fancy and trying to convince everyone that they should follow your lead. There's you can look at today's society and that must happen all the time. But back then it's like magnified 10 times.
Yeah. And for all three of you, I was kind of interested in whether you had conversations and what some of the discussions were around what's the reality for each of these characters. What is their truth? What is it that they know, given the time period and the space in which you're setting this series? Having a character who's completely terrified of cats because he thinks that they, steal children's breath and have knives in their paws. That's something that he believes. Excellent timing. That's a truth in his world from his experiences. Or characters that don't know what a vacation is and have to have Stede explain it to them is a very real scenario to them. And so how did the idea of what is the truth to all of these characters individually also really help in terms of building out a lot of the narrative arcs and building out a lot of elements of these characters?
I think that just was important to me is like, if you're on this ship, you're running from something. And the fact that they're all running from something and trying to find out what are they running from. That to me seems interesting. And just piracy in general being like the New York City of things, like all the weirdos would gravitate there because they'd fit in. And then the class tourism of it, where he's a fancy man and they're from a brutal, violent place. And then we're going to watch them try to mix.
And when it comes to making comedy, one of the things that I always love is just kind of the presence that everybody has to have at every stage. You have to have that real presence and connectivity to the rhythm and the pacing when you're writing scripts for it, when you're developing, figuring out what scenes are going to work. It's such a crucial thing in terms of performances and the presence that you have to have with everybody on set. And then when you're going into post-production, the way that editing, can really change any single intention or rhythm and tone of a scene. And so I was interested kind of for the three of you in the journey of making this show, those moments where you really had to have a lot of presence with the material that you were working on in the process.
Comedy can go wrong at any time and will. And there was so many times for this to fail throughout every piece that we put together. And I think that's the challenge. I mean, that's where it's really hard because, comedy is the most difficult, and if you can make it look easy and make it look natural, then you've achieved it. But you only get to that point when you have the experience of all the people that we've got on this production, right?
And it's so clear in the scripts. Reading the scripts, it's just there's no question of what the motivations are, who these people are, and then in casting it, David just knew, because he knew these characters so well, who was right for each part. And it was actually quite seamless, I found. But
it was helpful to go. We went back and forth on a few people because so many good people, amazing people auditioned for this show. And when you see an actor you're in awe of, and they're reading your little stupid half-hour script and taking it seriously. But there was so many great actors and so many different directions you can go in, that in casting, Garrett and I kicked some ideas back and forth just to see who was sticking for each of us.
And David, when you were writing to this ensemble of characters within this group of pirates, I was intrigued by the way in which you wrote intentions, whether it comes from a place of intellect or instinct, because, Stede, with his background in aristocracy, is very much trying to reason and navigate and figure out what he should do. Whereas the rest of the pirates on the ship, it's a kind of a survival instinct. It's that street smarts that they've developed on the sea that they have to lead from. And so how did that lead into different ways that you would write them in and out of scenarios?
Well, they all just want to live. And then Stede's on this other thing where he wants to heal and teach, and then there's kind of an outsider artist quality to him, and to see that he's exposing, because it is like fancy men. They're like, fancy man. And then he does do things with them that they like. And they're a little bit like, oh shit, I like that. What does that mean? To see that, to that weird little crossing and little bridges that he's making. That's the fun of the show to me, and the joy of it, and like the joy of watching Rhys play it, because he plays the hell out of it.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge joy in watching the character that you've created. And so Rhys, kind of, how did you think about navigating the different spaces where your character is kind of confident, sometimes a little overly confident, and maybe a little inept at things, but also, to David's point, the spaces where there's actually real attributes that come out of it. The fact that all of a sudden he's on a pirate ship reading them all a bedtime story in their hammocks, and they realize that they actually really like it, or, they're working with material and building flags, and they really appreciate being acknowledged and being seen by someone who's in a leadership position for them.
Yeah, it came down to a little bit of mothering, because everyone wants that sort of little bit of nurturing. And so I think that's that element of like, without him, and a regular captain, a leader needs to have that quality, but most of them don't. They're just yelling and shouting, and they're smart, so they've got good orders in their head. They know what their plan is. But if you take that side out of it and just bring in this nurturing side of like, we could all have a hug, right? Then that's what the crew really wanted as well, because they're all sort of unloved, and so I think I went down that route a little bit, because that's what I think Stede wanted. And so there was touches of him showing some skills that he had, being able to dress a certain way, or be able to present himself in a certain way, that through being self-confident about the way he looked, and that he knew where the cutlery was lined up on the table, and if others didn't, then he had that. Or when he was at a party, I know how these people are thinking. He can think like them. And so it was those little things that you don't show off about in front of the rest of the guys, but just sort of slowly implement, and they'll respect that. And then you've got to have each other's back. At the end of the day, there's got to be camaraderie. And that's what we got eventually.
Yeah. Well, kind of going back to what you all said earlier about making comedy look effortless, I feel like that's when you can tell how much work and how much detail has gone into it behind the scenes. So congratulations on a really fantastic season that makes the comedy look effortless. And thank you so much for sharing all of this.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's a nice interview.